The year was 1965. Harlem breathed with a different rhythm then, a syncopated heartbeat of jazz horns and street corner prophets, of numbers runners and storefront churches, of men who wore their dignity like armor against a world that tried daily to strip them of it. The summer heat sat heavy on the brownstone steps, thick as motor oil, and the air tasted of sweat and cigarettes and something else, electric tension that hummed just below the surface of every conversation, every handshake, every glance exchanged between men who understood that respect was the only currency that truly mattered. To most Americans, Harlem was a headline, a problem to be discussed on evening news broadcasts by men who had never walked its streets. But to Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, it was a kingdom, his kingdom, and he ruled it not with an iron fist, but with something far more dangerous, an iron will sharpened by decades of survival, strategy, and an understanding of human nature so profound it bordered on prescience. There were men who commanded through fear, and then there was Bumpy Johnson, who commanded through something more complex, a mixture of respect, calculated generosity, and the unspoken promise that crossing him was not just dangerous, but philosophically unwise. He was 58 years old that summer, his hair graying at the temples, his face a topographical map of every war he'd fought and won. And he was about to teach a lesson that would echo through Harlem for generations. But first, a white man from downtown would need to make the worst mistake of his career. Bumpy Johnson was not just the numbers king of Harlem, though that title alone would have secured his legend. He was a philosopher of the streets, a man who could quote Marcus Aurelius and move heroin with equal precision, who understood that true power came not from violence, though he was capable of extraordinary violence, but from controlling the narrative. He'd learned this during his years in Sing Sing, where he'd consumed books the way other men consumed meals, building an intellectual fortress that would serve him far better than any weapon. By 1965, Bumpy had survived wars that would have destroyed lesser men. He'd survived Lucky Luciano's attempts to control Harlem's numbers racket in the 30s. He'd survived a decade in prison. He'd survived the Genovese family's expansion into his territory. He'd survived because he understood a fundamental truth that eluded most criminals. The game was never about the money. It was about the respect. Money evaporated. Respect compounded. His domain stretched from 110th Street to 155th, from river to river, a checkerboard of legitimate businesses fronting illegitimate enterprises, all running with the efficiency of a Swiss watch. The barber shops where numbers were written, the social clubs where policy slips exchanged hands, the restaurants where disputes were settled over plates of fried chicken and collard greens, where Bumpy would sit in his usual corner booth, his back to the wall, his eyes missing nothing. He dressed like a Wall Street banker, three-piece suits in charcoal and navy, silk ties, Italian leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. This was deliberate. When white police officers stopped him, which they did regularly, they found a man who spoke better English than they did, who carried himself with more dignity than they'd ever known. It infuriated them. It was meant to. A man's appearance is his first argument, Bumpy would say to the young men who worked for him, the ones who wanted to dress like cowboys, all flash and foolishness. Before you open your mouth, your suit has already made its case. Harlem loved him for this. White authorities feared him for it. And into this carefully balanced world, in the spring of 1965, came a man who understood neither love nor fear, but only the hollow applause of studio audiences. Calvin Morris had been hosting the evening hour for 3 years when he decided that what his show needed was an edge, a controversial sparkle to boost ratings that had plateaued somewhere between respectable and forgotten. His program aired at 10 p.m. on a regional station that reached Manhattan and the surrounding boroughs, a talk show format that borrowed heavily from Jack Parr's style, but lacked Parr's wit, replacing it with something cheaper: provocation. Morris was 42, handsome in a bland, symmetrical way that photographed well, but left no lasting impression. He'd grown up in Connecticut, the son of an insurance executive, had attended Yale for 2 years before dropping out to pursue entertainment, and had never in his life faced a consequence he couldn't charm or buy his way out of. His world was one of green rooms and expense accounts, of assistants who laughed at jokes that weren't funny, and yes-men who reinforced his belief that he was not just a television host, but a cultural commentator of significance. "People want controversy," he told his producer, Martin Kelso, during a meeting in March. They were in Morris's office at the station, a room decorated with framed photographs of himself shaking hands with minor celebrities. "They're tired of softball interviews. We need to make news, not just report it." Kelso, who was older and wiser and deeply worried about their jobs, tried caution. "Calvin, there's controversial, and then there's what? Dangerous? Martin, we're a talk show. We're not going to war." But in a way, they were. Kelso just didn't know it yet. The idea came to Morris after reading a series of articles in the New York Times about organized crime's influence in Harlem. The articles, written by reporters who'd never spent more than an afternoon uptown, painted Bumpy Johnson as a criminal kingpin, a menace, a symbol of everything wrong with urban America. Morris saw something else, an opportunity. "What if," he said, leaning back in his chair with the expression of a man who believed he'd just had a revolutionary thought, "we did an episode about crime in Harlem, but instead of the usual hand-wringing, we really go after them, call them out by name, show that we're not afraid." "Them?" Kelso asked. "The criminals, the numbers runners, Johnson specifically, Bumpy Johnson." Morris pronounced the name with a slight sneer, as if it were beneath him to speak it. "We'll call it the Kings of Crime or something like that. Exposé format. Really stick it to these people." These people, 2 words that carried the weight of centuries. Kelso felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Calvin, I don't think it's perfect. We'll show clips from Harlem, talk about the numbers racket, maybe get a cop or a prosecutor on to discuss how men like Johnson corrupt entire neighborhoods. It'll be powerful television. It'll be a disaster. It'll be ratings," Morris countered, and that, for him, was the only argument that mattered. The segment was scheduled for May 15, 1965. Morris spent 3 weeks preparing, which mostly meant having his research assistants compile newspaper clippings and police reports, none of which he read thoroughly. He was building a narrative, not investigating a truth, and the narrative he wanted was simple. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal who preyed on his own community, who kept Harlem in chains with his illegal gambling operations, who represented everything backward and brutal about urban crime. The fact that Bumpy did run an illegal gambling operation was true. The fact that he was violent when necessary was true. But truth and accuracy are not the same thing, and Morris had no interest in accuracy. He wanted villains, clear and uncomplicated, because villains made for good television. He gave no thought to who might be watching. He gave no thought to the reality that Harlem had its own power structures, its own codes, its own justice system that operated parallel to, and sometimes in spite of, the official one. He gave no thought to the fact that publicly insulting a man like Bumpy Johnson on television was not an act of journalism, but an act of war. The night of the broadcast, Morris felt electric with anticipation. The studio audience had been primed, stacked with people who would applaud on cue, who would provide the validation he craved. The cameras were positioned, the lights were bright enough to blind. He'd chosen a navy blue suit, power colors, and his hair was swept back in the style of Edward R. Murrow, because Calvin Morris saw himself as a crusader, a truth-teller, a man who wasn't afraid to speak truth to power. He was about to learn a lesson about what power actually looked like. Bumpy Johnson heard about the show 3 days before it aired.
Information in Harlem moved like water, finding every crack, every crevice, and Bumpy had people everywhere. Bartenders and secretaries, janitors and taxi drivers, the invisible army of working people who saw everything and shared it with the man who'd helped their cousin make bail or paid for their daughter's school clothes, or simply treated them like human beings when the rest of the world treated them like furniture. The news came from Jerome Watkins, who worked as a stagehand at the television station. Jerome was 24, nervous, sweating despite the cool evening as he sat across from Bumpy in the back room of Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue. The restaurant was closed, the chairs upturned on tables, the smell of fried fish still hanging in the air. "Mr. Johnson," Jerome began, his voice unsteady, "I thought you should know. There's this host, Calvin Morris, and he's doing this segment about you, about crime in Harlem. And, sir, he's saying things, terrible things." Bumpy sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table in front of him. He wore a gray suit, the jacket unbuttoned, a gold watch visible at his wrist. His face revealed nothing, which was itself revealing to anyone who knew him. When Bumpy was angry, he went quiet. When he was furious, he went still. "What kind of things?" His voice was soft, almost gentle. Jerome swallowed. "He calls you a thug, a predator. He says you're destroying Harlem, keeping people poor and desperate. He's got police footage, charts showing arrest rates. He's making you out to be the villain, Mr. Johnson, and he's using your name, your full name, on television." Silence. The kind of silence that had its own weight, its own presence in the room. Behind Bumpy, standing against the wall, were two of his men, Franklin, built like a heavyweight boxer, and James, slim and quiet, with eyes that tracked everything. Neither moved, neither spoke. They understood that their role right now was simply to exist, to be witnesses to whatever decision Bumpy was about to make. "Does Morris know that I know?" Bumpy asked, finally. I don't think so, sir. I didn't tell anyone I was coming here."
"Good. Don't." Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a roll of bills, peeled off 5 20s, and slid them across the table. "For your time, Jerome, and for your discretion." Jerome took the money with trembling hands. "What are you going to do, Mr. Johnson?" Bumpy smiled then, and it was not a comforting expression. It was the smile of a man who had just seen all the moves ahead, who had already won the game, but was going to play it out anyway, savoring each step. "I'm going to watch the show," he said, "and then I'm going to teach Mr. Morris about respect." May 15th, 1965. The broadcast began at 10 p.m. sharp. Bumpy watched it from his apartment on 147th Street, a spacious third-floor residence with tall windows that overlooked the street below. The apartment was furnished simply but elegantly: leather chairs, mahogany bookshelves lined with volumes on history and philosophy, African sculptures that he'd been collecting since the 40s. His wife, Mamie, sat beside him on the sofa, her hand resting on his arm, feeling the tension in his body, even though his face remained calm. On the television screen, Calvin Morris smiled his manufactured smile at the camera. Behind him, a blown-up photograph of Harlem appeared, a street scene, children playing near a fire hydrant, brownstone buildings. The image dissolved into a mugshot. Bumpy's mugshot from 1952. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morris began, his voice dripping with manufactured gravitas, "tonight we're going to talk about the criminal empire that operates in the shadows of our great city. We're going to talk about a man who has turned an entire neighborhood into his personal casino, a man who profits from the desperation of his own people. Ladies and gentlemen, meet Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson." The audience applauded. They'd been told to. Morris continued for 12 minutes, building his case like a prosecutor who'd already decided on guilt.
He showed charts of arrest records, though most of those arrests had never led to convictions. He interviewed a police captain who spoke about the difficulty of prosecuting numbers operations, though he carefully avoided explaining why so many white police officers were on Bumpy's payroll. He brought on a minister from a small church in Brooklyn, not Harlem notably, who decried the moral decay caused by gambling. And then Morris delivered his conclusion, leaning into the camera with the expression of a man who believed he was making history. Ellsworth Johnson represents everything backward about urban America, he said. He is a predator, pure and simple, a man who has chosen crime over community, who has chosen to oppress his own people for personal profit. He operates with impunity because he has money, because he has connections, and because good people are too afraid to stand up to him.
Morris paused, letting the moment breathe. Well, I'm not afraid, and I think it's time someone said it publicly. Bumpy Johnson is a criminal, a thug, and a stain on Harlem's reputation. And if there was any justice in this world, he'd be in prison where he belongs. The audience erupted in applause. The camera pushed in on Morris's face, capturing what he believed was righteous defiance, but what actually looked like smug satisfaction. The broadcast ended. In his apartment, Bumpy turned off the television. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic from the street below, the eternal soundtrack of the city. Mame spoke first. "Baby, what are you going to do?" Bumpy stood, walked to the window, looked down at his kingdom. The streetlights painted everything in amber. A couple walked past, arm in arm. A taxi cruised by looking for a fare. Normal life continuing as it always did, unaware that something fundamental had just shifted. "I'm going to show Mr. Morris what real power looks like," Bumpy said quietly. "Not the power of insults and television cameras, the power of consequences." He turned to face his wife. His eyes were dark, unreadable. "And I'm going to do it without touching him once." The next morning, Bumpy made a single phone call. The man who answered was named Samuel Rothstein, a lawyer with an office on Madison Avenue and a client list that read like a who's who of New York's power structure. Rothstein was not a criminal lawyer. He specialized in libel, slander, and defamation. He was also someone who owed Bumpy a favor from 1959, when Bumpy had made a problem disappear for Rothstein's brother-in-law, a problem involving gambling debts and a threat of broken legs. "Sam," Bumpy said when Rothstein picked up, "I need to discuss a legal matter." They met for lunch at Keen's Steakhouse in Midtown, an establishment old enough to have served Teddy Roosevelt, where the walls were lined with church warden pipes smoked by a century of famous men. Bumpy arrived in a black suit, a red silk tie, carrying a leather briefcase. He looked like exactly what he was pretending to be, a successful businessman discussing a legal concern. Over porterhouse steaks and scotch, Bumpy laid out the situation. He showed Rothstein a typed transcript of Morris's broadcast, had him watch Morris's exact words, let the lawyer's trained mind identify every actionable statement. "He called you a criminal, a thug, a predator. He stated as fact that you run illegal gambling operations. He said you oppress your own people." The lawyer looked up. "Bumpy, some of this is technically opinion, but some of it crosses a line." "Can we sue?" "For defamation? Possibly. You'd have to prove that his statements were false, made with actual malice, and caused you quantifiable harm." Rothstein paused. "The challenge is that you are, in fact, a public figure involved in illegal activities," Bumpy finished. "I know. But Sam, think about it from another angle. What if we don't go after the truth or falsity of his statements? What if we go after something else?" Rothstein waited.
"Morris didn't just defame me," Bumpy said. "He used my image, my name, my police photograph without permission. He profited from my identity to sell advertising spots. That's not defamation, Sam. That's unauthorized commercial use of my likeness. That's a property rights violation." The lawyer's eyes widened slightly. It was a brilliant angle, threading the needle between Bumpy's actual criminality and his legal rights as a human being. Whether or not Bumpy was a criminal didn't matter for this particular claim. He still owned his own identity. "That's actually viable," Rothstein said slowly. "New York recognizes the right of publicity. If we can prove that Morris and his station used your identity for commercial purposes without permission and that this caused you harm—" "It did cause me harm," Bumpy said. "My business interests have been affected. Associates have become nervous. Legitimate ventures I'm involved in have faced questions, and I have the documentation to prove it." He did. Bumpy had spent the morning collecting affidavits from the 3 legitimate businesses he owned: a dry cleaning operation, a restaurant, and a real estate holding company. All were entirely legal, and all had seen partners and clients express concern after the broadcast. It was theater, carefully staged, but it was theater that would hold up in court. Rothstein leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at his lips. "You want to sue Calvin Morris for violating your right of publicity?" "I want to bury him," Bumpy said simply. "Legally, publicly. I want him to understand that there are consequences to disrespecting people, even people he thinks are beneath him, especially people he thinks are beneath him." This could get expensive. Legal fees, court costs, depositions. Bumpy opened his briefcase, withdrew an envelope stuffed with $100 bills, and placed it on the table between them. "Will that cover the retainer?" Rothstein looked at the envelope, then at Bumpy. "I'll have the papers filed by end of business tomorrow." The lawsuit hit the newspapers 3 days later. "Harlem Numbers King sues TV host for libel and unauthorized use of likeness," read the headline in the Daily News. The Times ran a more measured piece. "Controversial figure files suit against television personality." But the damage was immediate and precise. Calvin Morris first learned about it from his producer, Martin Kelso, who looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight. "Calvin, we have a problem," Kelso said, standing in Morris's office doorway at 8 a.m., holding a copy of the Daily News. Calvin, who'd been riding high on the modest ratings bump his exposé had generated, looked up from his coffee. "What kind of problem?" "The Bumpy Johnson kind." Kelso threw the newspaper on Morris's desk. "He's suing you, us, the station, for $2 million.
Morris felt his stomach drop. $2 million was more money than the station generated in a year. It was more money than he'd make in a lifetime. "He can't. That's insane. I was doing journalism, protected speech, First Amendment." "Read the complaint," Kelso said grimly. "He's not claiming defamation. He's claiming you used his identity for commercial purposes without permission. It's a property rights suit." Morris grabbed the paper, scanning the article with increasing horror. The lawsuit argued that the station had used Bumpy's name, likeness, and identity to draw viewers and sell advertising, and that Morris had personally profited from exploiting Bumpy's public persona without consent or compensation. It was creative, unexpected, and Morris's lawyer would confirm later that day, potentially valid. "This is extortion," Morris said, his voice rising. "He's trying to intimidate me into silence. We'll fight this. We'll win." But even as he said it, he felt the first tremors of real fear. Not because he thought Bumpy Johnson would have him killed. That seemed too theatrical, too movie-like. No, the fear came from something more insidious, the realization that he'd stepped into a world where the rules he understood didn't apply, where his advantages of race and class and respectability could be turned against him. The station's owner, Gregory Hartwell, confirmed this fear in a meeting later that afternoon. Hartwell was 65, a businessman who'd built his small broadcasting empire through careful risk management and even more careful accounting. He had neither the resources nor the appetite for a protracted legal battle. "Calvin," he said, sitting behind his oak desk with the expression of a man calculating losses, "I want you to understand our position.
This lawsuit, even if we win, and that's a big if, will cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. Our insurance will cover some of it, but not all. Meanwhile, the publicity is terrible. We look like we're attacking this man, and regardless of what he is or isn't, half of Harlem sees him as a folk hero. So what are you saying? I'm saying that I need you to think very carefully about whether continuing this fight is worth it, for you, for the station, for any of us. Morris left that meeting understanding that he was alone. The station would defend itself, but they wouldn't defend him with any particular vigor. His agent, when he called, was even less reassuring. "Calvin, this is a mess. Stations don't want controversy that comes with legal bills attached. You need to make this go away." But how? Morris had no experience with being the target rather than the targeter. He'd spent his career throwing punches at people too poor or too marginalized to punch back. Bumpy Johnson was neither. 2 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, Morris received a phone call at his apartment. It was 11 p.m., late enough that the call itself was unsettling. He answered cautiously. "Mr. Morris?" The voice on the other end was calm, measured, educated. "This is Ellsworth Johnson. I believe we should talk."
Morris's mouth went dry. How did you get this number? Mr. Morris, I'm calling to offer you an opportunity, a chance to resolve our dispute like reasonable men. Are you interested in talking, or would you prefer to let the lawyers handle everything? There was no threat in Bumpy's voice. That was somehow more frightening than if there had been. This was a businessman proposing a negotiation, and Morris understood instinctively that refusing would be a mistake. "I'll talk," Morris said. "Good. Tomorrow evening, 7 p.m., Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue in Harlem. Come alone. We'll have a conversation." "I don't think—" "Mr. Morris," Bumpy interrupted gently, "you've spent weeks telling your audience that you're not afraid of me. Surely you can spend 1 hour proving it." The line went dead. Morris didn't sleep that night. He considered not going, considered calling the police, considered running the story on his show, turning the meeting itself into news. But every option seemed to lead toward disaster, and beneath his fear was something else. Curiosity. He'd built his career on his ability to talk, to charm, to navigate difficult conversations. Maybe, he thought, he could talk his way out of this. It was the same arrogance that had gotten him into trouble in the first place. The next evening, Calvin Morris stepped out of a taxi at the corner of 7th Avenue and 134th Street. He dressed carefully, a gray suit, conservative, respectful, and left his wallet in the cab, bringing only $100 in cash and his identification. If he was robbed, he'd lose little. If he was killed, well, he tried not to think about that. Wells Restaurant was a modest establishment, its windows steamed from cooking, its shine hand-painted and fading. Morris had never been to this part of Harlem before, had only driven through it with his car doors locked. Now, stepping out onto the sidewalk, he felt a dozen eyes on him, felt the weight of being the other, the outsider, the one who didn't belong. It was a feeling he'd never experienced in his life. For the first time, Calvin Morris understood something about the people he'd so casually maligned on television. He pushed open the restaurant door. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of frying chicken, collard greens, and cornbread. The restaurant was nearly empty, 2 customers at the counter, a waitress wiping down tables. At the back, in a corner booth, sat Bumpy Johnson.
He looked nothing like his mugshot. This man wore a 3-piece navy suit, perfectly tailored, a gold watch chain visible across his vest. His hair was graying but still thick, combed back from a high forehead. His hands, folded on the table, were manicured. He looked like a banker, a lawyer, a professor. He looked like someone who belonged on Morris's show as a guest, not as a target. "Mr. Morris," Bumpy said, gesturing to the seat across from him, "thank you for coming." Morris sat, feeling the cracked vinyl of the booth beneath him, feeling his heart hammering against his ribs. Up close, Bumpy's eyes were what struck him. Dark, intelligent, measuring. They were the eyes of a man who saw through pretense, through performance, straight to the truth underneath. "Would you like something to eat?" Bumpy asked. "The fried chicken here is exceptional." "I'm not hungry." "No, I don't imagine you are." Bumpy signaled to the waitress, ordered coffee for both of them, waited until she'd poured and departed before continuing. "Mr. Morris, do you know why I asked you here?" "To threaten me, I assume?" Bumpy smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "If I wanted to threaten you, Mr. Morris, we wouldn't be having this conversation. No, I asked you here because I believe in giving a man a chance to understand his mistake before he pays for it. Consider this an education." "I didn't make a mistake. I reported the truth." "You reported a truth," Bumpy corrected. "A selective truth, chosen for maximum dramatic effect and minimum context. You called me a thug and a predator. You said I oppress my own people. Do you know what I did yesterday, Mr. Morris?" Morris said nothing. "I paid for Loretta Washington's cancer treatment at Harlem Hospital. She's 73, worked as a seamstress her whole life, has no family, no insurance. The hospital was going to turn her away. I made sure they didn't. Do you know what I did last week?" Silence. "I mediated a dispute between two young men who were about to kill each other over a girl. I sat them down, talked them through it, probably saved both their lives. Do you know what I do every day, Mr. Morris? I maintain order in a community that the police have given up on, in a neighborhood that City Hall has forgotten, among people who've been told their entire lives that they don't matter." Bumpy leaned forward slightly, his voice remaining calm but gaining intensity. "I'm not a saint. I run illegal gambling operations. I've hurt people who tried to hurt me. I've broken laws that I believe are unjust. But I am not a thug, Mr. Morris. I am a man who takes care of his community in the only ways available to someone like me. You, sitting in your studio in Midtown, have no idea what that means, no idea what it costs, no idea what responsibilities I carry." Morris found his voice. "You're a criminal. That's not opinion, that's fact. I'm a criminal by the laws written by people who've never walked these streets, yes. But you're something worse. You're a coward who profits from attacking people who can't defend themselves in your world. You hid behind your cameras and your audience and your white skin, and you decided that I was an acceptable target, because in your mind I'm just another—" Bumpy didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Morris felt shame burn through him, followed immediately by defensive anger. "I have freedom of speech. You have legal protection for your speech. You don't have protection from its consequences. That's what you're learning now, Mr. Morris. Actions have consequences. Words have consequences. And you're about to understand that fully." "The lawsuit," Morris said. "You want money." Bumpy laughed, and it was genuine amusement. "Mr. Morris, I don't need your money. I have more money than you'll ever see. No, I don't want your money." "Then what do you want?" Bumpy picked up his coffee cup, took a slow sip, set it down with deliberate care. When he spoke again, his voice was soft, but carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I want you to understand respect. I want you to know what it feels like to be publicly humiliated, to have your reputation destroyed, to feel powerless. I want you to experience exactly what you tried to do to me. And Mr. Morris, I want you to know that it's happening not because I'm violent, not because I'm a thug, but because I'm smarter than you. I've outplayed you using the very system you thought protected you." He reached into his jacket pocket, withdrew a folded document, and slid it across the table. "This is a settlement offer. You will go on your television program and issue a public apology. You will admit that you presented a one-sided narrative, that you failed to provide context, and that you regret any harm caused by your characterization of me. You will also donate $50,000 to the Harlem Youth Center, and the station will run a month-long series on positive community leaders in Harlem, none of which will mention me." Morris stared at the document. "And if I refuse? Then we go to court, and Mr. Morris, I will win. Maybe not on every count, but I'll win enough, and even if I lose, the process alone will destroy you. You'll spend the next 2 years in depositions and courtrooms. Every statement you made about me will be examined. Your sources will be questioned. Your research, or lack thereof, will be exposed. The station will settle, will throw you under the bus to protect themselves, and you'll be left unemployed, unemployable, and buried under legal debt. Bumpy leaned back in the booth, his expression almost sympathetic.
Or you can apologize. You can admit you were wrong. You can take your medicine and move on with your life. It's not a pleasant choice, Mr. Morris, but it's the only choice you have. The coffee shop was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic. Morris looked at the settlement document, then at Bumpy, then back at the document. He thought about his career, his reputation, his future. He thought about the 100 ways this could get worse, and he understood that he'd walked into this restaurant with no leverage, no power, no options. He'd been outmaneuvered by a man he'd dismissed as a street criminal. "How do I know you'll drop the lawsuit if I agree?" Morris asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because unlike you, Mr. Morris, I keep my word." There was nothing else to say. Morris signed the document with a pen Bumpy provided, his hand shaking slightly, his throat tight with humiliation and rage and something deeper, the bitter taste of understanding that he'd been, from the beginning, completely out of his depth. 2 nights later, Calvin Morris delivered his apology on the evening hour. He wore a dark suit, no tie, and his face looked older somehow, the lines deeper, the confidence drained away. The studio audience had been told this was a special broadcast, but not what it would contain. When Morris began speaking, you could hear the confusion ripple through the seats. "Several weeks ago," Morris said, looking directly into the camera, "I presented a segment about crime in Harlem. In that segment, I characterized a man named Ellsworth Johnson in ways that were incomplete, lacking in context, and unfair. I presented him as simply a criminal, without acknowledging his role in his community or the complex circumstances that shape life in Harlem." His voice was steady, but anyone watching closely could see the muscle jumping in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the desk. "I made assumptions based on incomplete information. I allowed my own biases to color my reporting, and in doing so, I failed the basic standards of journalism and decency. I apologize to Mr. Johnson, to the people of Harlem, and to my viewers for this failure. I was wrong." The broadcast continued for another 2 minutes, Morris announcing the donation to the youth center, the upcoming series on community leaders. But the damage was done, not to Bumpy, to Morris. The next day, the network received hundreds of calls. Some praised Morris for his apology, more mocked him, questioned his integrity, wondered what had happened behind the scenes to force such a dramatic reversal. The media covered the apology, dissecting it, speculating about it, and in the process, Calvin Morris became the story in exactly the way Bumpy had planned. Within 3 weeks, the evening hour was canceled. The station cited low ratings and a new direction in programming, but everyone understood the truth. Morris had become toxic, a liability, a cautionary tale about hubris and consequence. He worked 3 more years in broadcasting, bouncing between smaller and smaller stations before finally leaving the industry entirely in 1968. He'd become the thing he most feared: irrelevant.
In Harlem, the story of Calvin Morris became legend. It was told in barber shops and bars, at dinner tables and street corners, passed down as a parable about respect and intelligence, about the difference between actual power and its imitation. Bumpy hadn't shot Morris, hadn't beaten him, hadn't touched him at all. He'd simply outthought him,
used the white man's own system against him, and in doing so had delivered a message that resonated far beyond this single incident. You cannot dismiss us. You cannot disrespect us. We are not helpless, not powerless, not without recourse. We know your world better than you know ours, and we can operate in it with precision. Bumpy Johnson never spoke publicly about the incident. He didn't need to. The story spoke for itself, growing with each retelling, becoming part of the larger mythology that surrounded him. By the time of his death in 1968, he was more than a numbers runner or a crime boss. He was a symbol of black intelligence, black dignity, black power operating within and against a system designed to crush it. The lesson was simple, though Calvin Morris never fully understood it. Respect is not given freely. It is earned through action, maintained through consistency, and defended with whatever tools are available. In 1965, Bumpy Johnson's tools were legal briefs and settlement agreements, the very mechanisms of the establishment, wielded by someone the establishment considered beneath notice. He'd turned their weapons against them, and he'd won. Years later, when students of Harlem history would ask about Bumpy Johnson's legacy, this story would always be mentioned. Not the violence, not the criminal empire, but this, the moment when a man dismissed as a thug proved to be more sophisticated, more strategic, and more effective than the respectable television host who'd tried to destroy him. It was a story about many things, about racism, certainly, about the way media shapes narrative and narrative shapes reality, but fundamentally, it was a story about respect, about the price of underestimating people based on your assumptions rather than their reality. Calvin Morris thought Bumpy Johnson was a criminal and nothing more. Bumpy Johnson proved he was a criminal and something much more dangerous, a philosopher who understood that true power comes not from the ability to hurt, but from the wisdom to know when, how, and whether to exercise that power. The television host who mocked him learned this lesson in the hardest way possible, not through violence, but through the slow, public destruction of everything he'd built, carried out with legal precision and poetic justice. In the end, Morris lost his career, but what he really lost was the comfortable delusion that respect was something he could demand without earning, that he could attack people without consequence, that his platform and his privilege were shields that would protect him from accountability. Bumpy taught him otherwise, and Harlem never forgot. Thanks for listening, folks. If you like that story and want more tales of intelligence, strategy, and street justice from history's most fascinating figures, be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any of these legendary stories.